The politics of criminal justice in America are inextricably tied to the politics of race in America. This is both a trivially obvious truism and an absolute precondition for understanding political reality. Social scientists have described those issues or customs or concepts that divide societies as cleavages, great sundering wounds that cut across the body politic. Societies are crisscrossed with such cleavages, in an almost inconceivable variety, but some cleavages are more persistent and more powerful than others. In America, race is that cleavage, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line. Race has always been the most common and most durable form of American social control, from the first colonies to right now, this very moment. The reasons for this run deep, well into the tangled knots of history, through any number of decisions taken by people long dead whose choices made the world that we take for granted. For our purposes, what matters is how the reality of the color line has shaped the assumptions and practices of the criminal justice system. In fact, if you really want to see which cleavages in a society matter and which do not, look at its justice system. This system decides questions of crime and punishment, guilt and innocence, ownership and dispossession. A society's code of laws, as enforced, cannot help but express the blunt facts of who holds power and who does not. So it should not surprise us that the American criminal justice system is a reflection of the balance of power in American society, and that power is contested on the basis of race, among others. This has been true since the development of that system, whether we consider the roots of Southern police departments and legally sanctioned slave patrols, or the legal dogmas that treated the enslaved as personal property outside of any legal protection. Here I want to focus on the two most important historical developments that shaped the present day concept of race and crime in our politics. One is the period of revolution and counter revolution from 1865 to 1877 that we call Reconstruction. The other is the civil rights movement of the 1940s through the 1960s, a second Reconstruction that overcame the most glaring failures of the first. In the simplest terms, Reconstruction was the first sustained attempt to create multiracial democracy in America. For a few brief years, ex slaves were citizens who made claim to the property and the political rights that had been denied to them under slavery. Backed with federal bayonets, democracy brought majority black governments to power in states that a decade before had been the most entrenched slave societies in the world. This revolution was met with a counter-revolution, and waves of political violence swept the South. This counter-revolution, which I think one could argue has never really ended, had a psychological and an economic component. The psychological one involved the truly inconceivable shock white Southerners felt at seeing their former property exercise its humanity. But even more important was the economic component. The white South's wealth was entirely ruined by the Civil War, both by the physical destruction of infrastructure and the legal abolition of its most important form of property. Without a cheap and submissive workforce, the displaced plantation elite could never rebuild its wealth and its power. All of this is to say, Reconstruction was simultaneously a conflict of race and class. The racist ideology of Southern whites, so frightfully shaken by the war, was always a means of justifying a particular set of economic arrangements that took from the many and gave to the few. The two could not be separated. Depriving the ex slaves of their democratic rights was the necessary precondition for depriving them of their economic rights as free people. Former Confederates, organized as paramilitaries under the control of the Democratic Party, the traditional party of the slave South, effectively carried on the Civil War well into the 1870s. Violence peaked during elections, when political mobilization brought large numbers of whites and blacks into direct contact that often served as the excuse for ambushes, skirmishes, and in some cases pitched battles. Black officials were regularly murdered, and white militias overthrew county governments dominated by black Republicans. This sustained terrorist campaign succeeded in intimidating Southern blacks and exhausting the federal government's willingness to uphold the cause of democratic equality. Once Reconstruction ended with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, majority white Democratic Party governments swept back into power. largely through the violent intimidation of black Republican voters. For decades, the reality of Reconstruction was systematically repressed in American memory. This began with the official justifications handed out by whites to explain the violent destruction of Southern democracy. Black officials were regularly accused of corruption, of stealing public funds and handing them out to family and cronies. These largely baseless claims were the basis for a powerful anti tax movement in the South. After all, why should Southerners pay income taxes to a government of crooks? In reality, these taxes were raised to spend on schools for both white and black children. But since universal education was not desirable from the perspective of planters who wanted dependent workers, these schools were victims of propaganda that painted all black office holders as ignorant and corrupt. Historians compounded the crime, as many prominent founders of professional historical studies in America were Southerners, like Woodrow Wilson, Princeton professor and future president who oversaw the brutal segregation of the federal civil service. These historians presented Reconstruction as a shameful inversion of the proper social order, which ended with a restoration of white supremacy and black disenfranchisement. For an idea of what this ideology meant in practice, watch Gone with the Wind. By 1900, these same states had established totally segregated societies, as rigidly divided as any in the world. The boundaries that divided white from black found their plainest expression in the justice system and how it did and did not recognize African Americans as citizens. Vagrancy laws were passed to serve as a pretext for arresting black men for whatever reason a police officer cared to choose. Juries routinely convicted these same men, who were then sentenced by judges to serve in the South's profitable convict labor system. In this sense, Southern blacks experienced the justice system as citizens, but one whose rights were not weighed as equal to those of their white fellow citizens. By contrast, lynching was a ritual of social control based on treating African Americans as less than citizens, as people with no claim to the protection of the law. Mob murders of black men, often based entirely on false accusations, demonstrated the impunity at the heart of Jim Crow, the open assertion that only whites had any rights to be respected under the law. And this impunity was compounded by the fact that virtually no courts ever prosecuted or convicted the people responsible for these killings. An often overlooked element in lynch murders is worth our attention. In many lynchings, the victim was accused of sexual assault against a white woman. In many cases, this was entirely invented. In other cases, the victim was part of a consensual relationship that was not tolerated under Jim Crow. But researchers have also found that in cases of mass lynchings, where several African Americans were murdered together or in close succession, the weeks leading up to the killings were full of media stories about a coming black plot to rise up and massacre the white population. Newspapers were full of wild rumors of conspiracies uncovered at the last moment, of elaborate plans to poison water supplies or overrun rural towns. These sorts of pretexts went back decades, but they became common during Reconstruction, and always as the justification for some act of white mass violence against blacks. They were completely baseless claims, but they produced an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that was discharged through collective murder. Now, this takes us to the second Reconstruction. The civil rights movement is a fascinating example, like Reconstruction, of the ways in which a society remembers and misremembers its history. On the one hand, the civil rights movement is remembered as a sort of passion play of American democracy, a story of brave people standing up for their God given constitutional rights and enduring violence without reprisal as an expression of their moral nobility. This view takes the climax of the movement to be the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, proof of the federal government's commitment to ensuring the equal political rights of all citizens regardless of race. Of course, this version of the movement's history airbrushes much of its complexity and the extent to which it was only ever marginally popular among Americans at large. But its biggest failing is its unwillingness to keep telling the story of what developed in the late 1960s as an outcome of both the movement's successes and its failures. Just as the civil rights movement scored its crowning political victories in Washington, uprisings began to erupt in American cities. These uprisings centered in segregated black neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods, already poor, were enduring the effects of deindustrialization, which destroyed working class and middle class jobs and wreaked enormous social harm. They were also neighborhoods that were heavily and aggressively policed. A large body of political science literature studies the link between rising popular expectations and the emergence of political violence and revolutionary violence. Basically, as people come to believe that their position in society is improving, that they can begin to look forward to better days for themselves and their families, they become extremely sensitive to anything that could threaten or repress those improvements. Each civil rights victory in America was met with a countermove from die-hard opponents of integration, which contributed to a widespread sense that the movement was reaching its maximum potential. Once the federal government struck down Jim Crow, it lost interest in black demands for deeper social and economic reforms. Northern blacks, who already held the rights denied under Jim Crow, found that formal political equality could not address police violence, economic inequality, and the deeper structural issues that shaped the racial cleavage in American life. In places like Watts, Detroit, Harlem, Newark, Washington, and Philadelphia, incidents of police brutality sparked street battles that developed into full scale uprisings. In the most intense cases, where the National Guard was needed to put down the unrest, dozens were killed and property damage ran into the billions. These uprisings, frequently though misleadingly called race riots, came to define the legacy of the civil rights movement in the eyes of its opponents, who would retain power in American politics well into the 21st century. In this view, a sustained campaign of lawbreaking provoked the federal government into intervening in the internal affairs of southern states, and the result of this meddling was a series of violent riots marked by looting and violence against the authorities. After all, since the riots had intensified following the passage of civil rights laws, this violence must be about something else. It can't be the protest of ignored and marginalized people, since legally they were no longer ignored or marginalized. Therefore, the rioters' only motives could have only been a desire to steal or cause harm, or possibly to provoke a real revolution against the government. In either case, the chief legacy of the civil rights movement in this regard for these people was that it made violent crime the decisive problem in American politics. The Nixon administration made a concerted effort to appeal to voters swayed by this logic. Nixon had only narrowly won election in 1968, and he and his aides decided upon a so-called Southern strategy designed to win Southern whites away from their ancestral loyalty to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party would make itself the political home for Southern whites alienated by the Democrats' embrace of civil rights. The same strategy could be employed to win white ethnic voters in the North, whose loyalty to the New Deal Democrats was strained by the party's civil rights stance. But for the strategy to work, the Republican Party could not openly declare itself to be against the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It could not make the explicitly racist appeals that had been possible as recently as the 1940s. The party had to communicate to alienated white voters that it was on their side, while still convincing the country at large that it accepted the reality of formal black equality. This Southern strategy succeeded for a number of reasons, not least of which was the proliferation of so-called dog whistle political tactics. Just as a dog whistle produces sound in ranges dogs can hear but humans cannot, dog whistle tactics aim to convey racialized political claims to a certain audience, while to others it would sound like something innocuous. There are any number of specific dog whistle tactics, but let's consider the concept of law and order as political rhetoric. Nixon ran hard on law and order, much like Trump did last year and George H.W. Bush did in 1988. Nixon argued that average Americans were terrorized by violent crime, which was rising across the country. This crime wave, according to Nixon, was the result of the supposed moral disorder in American life, like the proliferation of drugs, the hippie counterculture, the student protests against the Vietnam War, and, of course, the black radicals bringing riots to the inner cities. The very real fear of crime, along with politicized resentments about the counterculture and anger at opponents of the Vietnam War, could be easily wed to the belief that while blacks might have previously been treated unfairly, there was nothing that justified riots and violence. In this way, the issue of black equality and the meaning of American democracy began to be subsumed into a fear of violent crime and a resulting willingness to empower the government to do whatever was necessary to restore order. As the war on drugs accelerated in the 1970s, along with rising crime rates, the law and order appeal helped lay the basis for the present system of racialized mass incarceration. Few political candidates harm themselves by accusing rivals of being soft on crime and promising to do a better job of getting tough on criminals. Probably the most famous example of a soft on crime dog whistle came from the 1988 campaign of Republican George H.W. Bush. Bush was running against Democrat Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, who as governor had approved a reform plan that gave some prisoners weekend passes outside of prison walls. One such inmate was Willie Horton, who committed violent crimes while on a pass. Watch the ad the Bush administration put together, and then read this short excerpt from an interview with Bush advisor Lee Atwater, one of the architects of the Southern strategy. Or consider the case of the Central Park Five, a group of black teenagers falsely accused and convicted of assaulting a jogger in Central Park. In the media frenzy surrounding the case, Donald Trump made one of his first political statements, demanding that the teens be executed and that the city unleash the police to reduce crime. Though Republicans pioneered this political strategy, it appealed to Democrats as well. This was especially true in the 1990s. The presidency of Ronald Reagan and the rise of the modern conservative movement had put Democrats on the defensive. After three presidential election losses in a row, in 1992 the Democrats ran moderate Southern Governor Bill Clinton, who pledged to crack down on crime as previous Democrats would not. One result was the 1994 crime bill, championed in the Senate by Joe Biden, which dramatically accelerated the growth of the prison population. We'll have cause to discuss many of these cases in more detail. What matters most is that when we examine the functioning of the American justice system, we are examining institutions that are the products of history, and we have to understand how they developed and how they function as products of history if we want to make history of our own and bend these institutions toward more just ends.